You're complaining about your 9 to 5 job, sitting in traffic, dealing with difficult customers, and thinking life couldn't get any worse. Well, let me tell you something that'll make you appreciate your modern workplace real quick. We're about to dive into some of the most disturbing, disgusting, and downright dangerous jobs from medieval times that would make your worst Monday morning look like a tropical vacation. I'm talking about occupations so revolting that even thinking about them might make you lose your lunch. Jobs that were so risky, most people doing them didn't live to see their 30th birthday. And the craziest part? These weren't rare, obscure positions that only existed in some remote village. These were legitimate, necessary jobs that kept medieval society functioning, no matter how horrifying they were. Let's kick things off with something that sounds innocent enough, but was actually a complete nightmare. The gong farmer. Now, before you start thinking this has anything to do with actual farming, let me stop you right there. These weren't people working in fields growing crops. Gong farmers were the brave souls responsible for cleaning out medieval toilets. And when I say cleaning out, I mean diving head first into human waste. Medieval toilets weren't like the porcelain thrones we have today. They were basically wooden seats built over deep pits, and when those pits filled up, somebody had to empty them. That somebody was the gong farmer. These workers would climb down into these disgusting cesspits, sometimes 20 feet deep, and shovel out years' worth of accumulated human waste with nothing but basic tools and whatever protection they could manage. But here's where it gets really disturbing. The job was so dangerous that gong farmers were only allowed to work at night, not because of privacy concerns, but because the methane gases building up in these pits could literally kill them. Many gong farmers died from toxic gas poisoning, and others drowned in the waste when the sides of the pits collapsed. The smell was so overwhelming that these workers were banned from living in regular neighborhoods. They had to live in designated areas outside town limits because their odor was considered unbearable by everyone else. And get this, despite the horrific nature of the job, gong farmers were actually paid relatively well for their time. The work was so disgusting and dangerous that they could charge premium rates. But even with good pay, most people would rather live in poverty than take on this occupation. The social stigma was so intense that gong farmer families were often shunned for generations. Moving on to our next disturbing occupation, the plague doctor. Now, you might think you know about plague doctors because of those creepy bird-like masks they wore, but the reality of this job was far more horrifying than most people realize. These weren't trained medical professionals in the way we think of doctors today. Most plague doctors were basically desperate people willing to risk almost certain death for decent pay. When the Black Death swept through Europe, killing roughly 1/3 of the population, somebody had to tend to the sick and dying. Enter the plague doctors, who would walk through infected neighborhoods in their bizarre leather outfits, complete with those infamous beaked masks filled with herbs and spices that were supposed to filter out bad air. Spoiler alert, they didn't work. The job description was pretty straightforward: visit plague victims, attempt basic treatments, and record deaths. Simple enough, right? Wrong. The mortality rate for plague doctors was astronomical. Most lasted only a few weeks or months before contracting the disease themselves. They knew they were essentially signing their own death warrants, but the pay was so good that desperate people kept taking the job. But the truly disturbing part wasn't just the risk of death. Plague doctors were often the only people willing to enter plague-infested areas, which meant they witnessed horrors that would haunt anyone for life. Entire families dead in their homes, children orphaned and starving, streets lined with corpses that nobody was alive to bury. These doctors weren't just treating patients, they were walking through hell on earth day after day until the plague claimed them too. The psychological toll was immense. Many plague doctors who survived reported severe mental trauma, what we'd probably call PTSD today. They'd seen so much death and suffering that they could never fully recover. Some became alcoholics, others completely withdrew from society, and many developed obsessive behaviors around cleanliness and death. Now let's talk about the Sin Eater, an occupation so bizarre and disturbing that it sounds like something out of a horror movie. When someone died in medieval times, especially if they had lived a particularly sinful life, families would hire a sin eater to literally consume the deceased person's sins. The belief was that by eating a meal over the corpse, the sin eater would absorb all the dead person's wrongdoings, allowing the deceased to enter heaven with a clean slate. The ritual itself was deeply unsettling. The sin eater, usually an extremely poor and desperate person, would sit beside the corpse and eat bread and drink ale or beer that had been placed on the dead body. Sometimes the food was actually laid directly on the chest or stomach of the deceased. As they ate, they would recite prayers and incantations, supposedly transferring the sins from the dead person to themselves. But here's the truly disturbing part. Sin eaters were considered to be carrying the sins of everyone whose sins they had consumed. This made them social outcasts of the worst kind. People believed sin eaters were walking repositories of evil, condemned to carry the weight of countless sins until their own deaths. They were banned from churches, couldn't marry into respectable families, and were often forced to live alone on the outskirts of communities. The job paid reasonably well because nobody else would do it, but the social cost was devastating. Sin eaters lived in complete isolation, feared and reviled by everyone around them. Many developed severe psychological problems from the combination of social isolation and the constant reminder that they were believed to be carriers of evil. When a sin eater died, often no one would even attend their funeral, believing that their accumulated sins might somehow transfer to anyone present. What's even more twisted is that sin eaters knew they were essentially destroying their own souls for money. The church taught that these accumulated sins would follow them into the afterlife, meaning they were literally damning themselves for eternity just to help grieving families. Talk about the ultimate sacrifice, trading your eternal salvation for a few coins and some stale bread. Next up, we have the leech collector. And no, this isn't some medieval Pokemon trainer. These people had to wade into swamps, marshes, and stagnant ponds to collect medicinal leeches with their bare legs. The process was exactly as horrifying as it sounds. Leech collectors would roll up their pants, step into leech-infested waters, and just stand there while dozens of these blood-sucking parasites latched onto their skin. The demand for leeches was massive because medieval medicine was obsessed with bloodletting. Doctors believed that most illnesses were caused by having too much blood, so they'd attach leeches to patients to drain out the excess. This meant someone had to supply a constant stream of fresh leeches, and that someone was willing to let these creatures feast on their own blood day after day. But the real nightmare wasn't just the leeches themselves. These collectors had to work in the most disease-ridden environments imaginable. Stagnant swamp water was breeding grounds for every nasty infection you can think of. Open wounds from leech bites would get infected with bacteria that could cause gangrene, blood poisoning, or worse. Many leech collectors lost limbs or died from infections that started as simple leech bite wounds. And here's something that'll really make your skin crawl. Experienced leech collectors could tell the quality of different leeches by how they felt while feeding. They'd actually grade the leeches based on their sucking power and blood consumption rate while the creatures were still attached to their legs. Imagine having such intimate knowledge of blood-sucking parasites that you could rate their performance while they're draining your own blood. Then there's the knocker-upper, which sounds inappropriate, but was actually a legitimate job that required people to be human alarm clocks. Before mechanical alarm clocks were common, factory workers needed someone to wake them up for their shifts. Knocker-uppers would walk through neighborhoods in the early morning hours, tapping on windows with long sticks or shooting peas at bedroom windows to wake people up. Sounds simple enough, right? Wrong again. The disturbing part wasn't the job itself, but the working conditions and risks involved. Knocker-uppers had to work in complete darkness, navigating dangerous medieval streets filled with criminals, wild animals, and open sewers. Many were mugged, attacked, or worse during their pre-dawn rounds. But the truly messed up aspect was that knocker-uppers were held personally responsible if someone overslept and lost their job. In a time when losing employment could mean starvation for an entire family, the pressure was immense. Some knocker-uppers would break windows or even break into homes to ensure people woke up, leading to violent confrontations with angry homeowners who thought they were being robbed. The job also attracted some seriously disturbed individuals who used their position to spy on families, case homes for future burglaries, or worse. There are historical records of knocker-uppers who would peek into windows, steal from properties, or harass women they encountered during their rounds. The lack of oversight and the early morning darkness created perfect conditions for predatory behavior. Now let's discuss the Tasher, urban scavengers who made their living by crawling through London's medieval sewer systems looking for valuable items. These weren't just people picking through garbage, they were literally swimming through rivers of human waste, dead animals, and toxic runoff in underground tunnels that could collapse at any moment. Toshers would venture into the sewers armed with nothing but lanterns and long poles, searching for anything of value that had been dropped or discarded. They'd find coins, jewelry, metal scraps, bones that could be sold to button makers, and anything else that might fetch a few pennies. But the working conditions were absolutely hellish. The sewer tunnels were filled with poisonous gases that could knock a person unconscious in seconds. Many Toshers died from gas poisoning, drowning in sewage, or getting lost in the maze-like tunnel systems. The tunnels were also home to massive rats that weren't afraid of humans, and these rats carried diseases that could kill within days. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was that Toshers often discovered human remains in the sewers. Sometimes these were accident victims who had fallen into the system, but often they were murder victims whose bodies had been disposed of in the sewers. Toshers had to develop a twisted sense of normalcy around finding decomposing human bodies, treating them as just another obstacle in their daily work routine. The smell alone was enough to drive most people insane. Toshers would emerge from their shifts so saturated with the stench of sewage that they couldn't eat or sleep properly. Many developed chronic respiratory problems from breathing sewer gases, and their life expectancy was significantly shorter than the already low medieval average. So there you have it. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the other video on the screen.